She stared at me across the Christmas table, raised her glass, and said, "My son could marry anyone." And he picked a damn shoe fixer. I didn't cry. I stood up, took off the shoes I'd stitched with my own hands for that day, and walked barefoot into the freezing snow. No one stopped me. No one apologized. 5 years later, I stood on stage at a global summit speaking to thousands, and she sat in the front row silent, unable to say a word. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now to witness shocking, powerful, and unforgettable stories like this one. The room was too quiet for a space that grand. You could hear the soft buzz of projectors warming up the shuffle of designer heels on polished marble, the distant clink of cutlery from the VIP lounge behind the velvet ropes. But all of it faded the moment the lights dimmed and the host's voice echoed through the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker for the Global Reputation Summit 2025, Sierra Blake, CEO of Resonair. Applause erupted, the kind that sounded polite, pre-programmed. Respectful, yes, but cautious, curious. She knew that sound well. It was the sound of people clapping for someone they still weren't sure they should revere or resent. Sierra adjusted the silver clasp on her navy sheath dress. No jewelry, no flash. Just clean lines and purpose. Her heels clicked steadily as she walked toward the stage, each step measured, each breath cold steel. The room was flooded with light now, and in the front row, as Sierra had known she would be, sat Margaret Langford, former senator, iron-spined matriarch, and the woman who once looked her in the eye and said, "My son will not marry someone who glues souls for a living." That was 5 years ago. Sierra's eyes met hers. The moment was quick, but it expanded inside her like thunder in a canyon. Margaret's expression didn't waver. Not surprise, not shame. Just that same unreadable stare, shoulders back, hands folded over a Prada clutch. But Sierra smiled. Not the tight-lipped corporate smile she'd mastered in boardrooms. This one was soft, deep, and deliberate. The kind of smile you give someone who once tried to break you and failed spectacularly. She turned her face to the audience. The 1,000-strong crowd of executives, journalists, investors, and skeptics staring up at her like she might offer them a secret. The host handed her the wireless mic. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Instead, she spoke into the silence. "You know what people never talk about?" Her voice was calm, even warm. Shoes. A ripple of confused laughter. Not the ones you buy, the ones you fix. She paused. Let the words settle. Then glanced toward the far back of the stage, where an old pair of men's boots stood in a glass case. Worn leather, cracked soles, faint, faded initials carved into the tongue, JRB. "My grandfather owned a shoe repair shop in South Philly," Sierra continued. "I started working there when I was 10. Summers, after school, Christmas Eve sometimes." She stepped forward slowly, speaking not to impress but to share. "People think fixing shoes is just a trade. But what you learn in that space on your knees holding something that's walked through someone's life is precision. It's listening. It's pain, too. Because no one brings you brand new shoes. They bring you broken ones. Ones that mattered." She looked out at them now, not as a CEO, not as a speaker, but as Sierra. And for the first time in years, she let herself remember what it felt like to smell glue under her nails, to sand down a soul until the machine screeched and sparked, to read someone's story in the way their heel wore down unevenly. In that shop, I learned that everything leaves a pattern, even pain, especially pain. She looked toward the row where Margaret sat. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. But it sharpened just slightly. People also think reputation is about power, that if you've got enough money, enough press, enough degrees, your name will be safe. But I've seen billion-dollar brands fall apart in 24 hours because they ignored one small crack in their story. Just like a shoe. More silence. Not stunned this time, but leaning in. Sierra turned and clicked the remote in her hand. Behind her, a screen flickered to life. It was a heat map of emotional sentiment, one of Resonaire's newest tools. Hundreds of tiny colored dots representing real-time feedback from users, media outlets, employees, and competitors. The interface was beautiful, sleek, terrifying. This, she said, gesturing to the map, is what we call resonance risk. It's not a press release. It's not a survey. It's the invisible truth underneath what people say. Another click. The map zoomed in, focusing on a particular brand that had recently survived a scandal through Resonaire's system. The audience recognized it immediately. There were audible gasps. "We don't repair brands," Sierra said. "We rewire them through listening, tracking emotional signals, identifying silent fractures before they break." Then she let her gaze settle again on Margaret. This time she didn't smile. "I've been called many things. Unqualified, uneducated, unpolished, but never ever unproven." The pause that followed was thick, charged. Sierra let it breathe, then dropped her voice to something low, intentional, grounded. "And that is how you build a $12 billion company." She turned back to the audience. "And now, if you'll let me, I'd like to show you how." As the lights dimmed again and her presentation began, no one dared check their phones, not even Margaret Langford. And somewhere buried beneath the layers of pride strategy and old-world pedigree, the matriarch finally blinked. Not in defeat, but in realization. The girl who once glued shoes had learned to mend something far more fragile, the truth, and she had done it at scale. From dust to code, from shame to keynote, from silence to a standing ovation, waiting just 5 minutes away. Rain had a way of making the whole block smell like old leather and rusted nails. The kind of rain that didn't just fall. It pressed steady and unapologetic down onto the cracked sidewalks of South Philly, soaking into bricks dripping from crooked awnings, pooling outside the door of Blake's shoe repair like it was trying to find a way in. Inside the hum of the belt, Sander cut through the patter of rain. Sierra leaned over the old bench. Goggles fogged slightly, her fingers steady as she glued the sole of a tan brogue back into place. Her apron was smeared with polish. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows, revealing the constellation of tiny scars that no one ever asked about. She liked it that way. The bell above the door jingled a flat, exhausted sound under the weight of wet air. She didn't look up at first. People came in all the time, usually hunched and hurried, clutching ruined shoes like they were confessing something. She had learned that shoes were never just shoes. They were apologies, missteps, regrets, escapes. And sometimes they were declarations. "I think I ruined them," a voice said. It wasn't the words that made her glance up. It was the tone measured tired, but carrying the kind of self-control that came from long practice. Like the speaker spent most of his days pretending not to feel things. He was standing there in a soaked charcoal suit that looked expensive even when dripping. Brown hair plastered to his forehead. One hand holding a black leather dress shoe like it had betrayed him. Sierra wiped her hands on a rag and stepped out from behind the counter. "Let's see," she said. He handed it over. The sole had split along the arch. Water had soaked through the leather. Not just ruined, drenched in defeat. She didn't speak for a moment. Instead, she held the shoe like a doctor examining a body. Turned it, pressed. It ran her thumb along the crack. Then looked at his other foot. Still wearing the match, soaked too. "You walked here in the rain?" she asked. He shrugged. "The Uber dropped me 3 blocks away. Flooded street." She nodded. "You're not from around here." A flicker of something curiosity maybe passed through his eyes. "How'd you guess?" Sierra lifted the shoe again. "No one from here wears Italian leather to walk in a storm." That drew a smile, barely. He extended a hand formal out of habit. "Nathan Langford." She hesitated, wiped her palm again before shaking his. "Sierra." There was a pause. "I can fix them," she said, gesturing to the shoes. "But you'll need to leave them overnight. The glue won't hold if they're soaked." Nathan glanced down at his feet. "Then I'll be limping home barefoot." Sierra moved without a word, disappeared into the back, then returned with a pair of worn sneakers. Faded blue. one soul a bit loose, but dry. "They're ugly," she said, "but they'll get you home." He looked at the shoes, then at her. "You do this for everyone." "No," she said, "just the ones who look like they haven't exhaled in days." Nathan chuckled, a low, surprised sound. He took the sneakers. "Thanks." Sierra watched him bend to switch shoes. She noticed his socks were mismatched, one navy, one black. Not the kind of detail a man like him usually missed. "You're not a lawyer, are you?" she asked offhand. He looked up, surprised again. "I am." "How'd you know?" "You talk like you've been arguing with ghosts." That stopped him. There was a long pause, and then he laughed again, softer this time. "That's not far off." Sierra leaned on the counter. "Family ghosts or courtroom ones?" He laced the sneakers slowly. "The kind that follow you home no matter how late it gets." For a moment, the shop felt warmer than it should have on a rainy afternoon. She handed him a claim ticket. "Come back tomorrow after 2. Nathan took it. "You sure they're salvageable?" Sierra held up the damaged shoe. "Everything is if you know where the fault lines are." He looked at her then, not like a customer, but like someone trying to map the shape of something he didn't understand yet. Then he nodded, said thank you, and left. The bell jingled again. The door closed behind him. Sierra stood in the silence that followed, staring at the counter where the claim ticket had just been exchanged. She didn't know it yet, not entirely, but something had shifted. Not in the way a romantic would describe it. Not sparks or lightning or fate. More like a gear catching in the right place for the first time in years. She returned to the workbench, placed Nathan's shoes carefully on the towel beside the heat lamp, opened her notebook, scribbled down Langford and the ticket number. Then, without thinking, she wrote beneath it, "Walks like he's carrying someone else's weight." The rain didn't let up for hours, but somehow the shop felt lighter. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. There were no grand declarations, no candlelit violins playing over rooftop views. Just a pair of old sneakers returned with a handwritten note tucked inside. "They walked better than I did. Thank you. N." That's how it started. Sierra didn't fall for Nathan Langford all at once. It happened the way slow rain eats through rust, gently, then permanently. She noticed the way he always paused before answering, like he was editing himself down to something less confrontational. She noticed how he asked questions not out of politeness but hunger. For understanding. For honesty. He came back for his shoes. Then again, 2 days later, with a different pair and a sheepish grin. Slipped on the subway. Again. That was lie number 1. He just wanted to see her. Sierra let him. Within a month, they were walking home together under the cracked street lamps of South Philly. He'd pick up her coffee when she forgot to eat. She'd text him random lines from business books she was reading online, piecing together a digital marketing idea that kept her up at night. She didn't fit into his world. He didn't belong in hers, and neither of them cared, until dinner with Margaret. The evening began with rain again. Not poetic romantic rain, just enough drizzle to flatten hair and ruin suede, Nathan had insisted. "She wants to meet you," he'd said, rubbing the back of his neck like a teenager about to disappoint someone. "She's just sharp. Don't let it get to you." Sierra wore a dress she found second-hand. Navy blue, modest neckline, well pressed. Her fingers smelled faintly of shoe polish from earlier that day. She didn't own perfume. She braided her hair to hide the uneven cut she'd done herself 6 months prior. The house was large, quiet, sterile, the kind of place where nothing ever spilled, and if it did, someone else cleaned it up. Margaret Langford opened the door herself. She didn't hug, just offered a dry smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be Sierra. Nathan's told me something about you. Something. Not much, not everything, just something." Sierra smiled. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Langford." "Oh, please, call me Margaret." It was not an invitation. Dinner was roasted duck with blood orange glaze, crystal water glasses, real linen napkins folded with militaristic precision. Sierra sat up straight, ate slowly, answered questions like she was on trial, and Margaret in her own way made sure she was. So she said between bites, "You run a shoe repair business." "I work in one," Sierra corrected. "My grandfather started it. I manage the front end and repairs." Margaret blinked. "And that's your career path?" Nathan glanced up, but Sierra raised a hand beneath the table. "I've got this," her fingers said. "For now," Sierra said. "But I'm also building a platform to help small businesses understand customer behavior through emotional data points." Margaret blinked again. Less out of surprise, more like she was trying to decide if that was a buzzword salad or a real sentence. "I see. Do you have a background in data analytics?" "No formal degree," Sierra said, her voice even. "Just a lot of reading. And pattern recognition. Turns out heels and algorithms aren't that different. They both wear down when misused." Nathan smiled. Margaret did not. "And where did you go to school?" Margaret asked, sipping wine. Sierra placed her fork down gently. "Nowhere fancy. Just the one where I learned to survive." Margaret leaned forward, folding her hands like she was announcing a verdict. "So you don't have a degree?" Sierra matched her tone without flinching. "No. But I have skilled hands and a very sharp brain. One of them fixes souls. The other builds systems." The silence that followed was so heavy it rattled the wine glasses. Margaret didn't respond. She turned to Nathan instead. "You're still planning to take the DC position, I assume?" "We're discussing it," he said. "It depends on a few things." Such as, he didn't answer. Dessert was plated. No one touched it. After they left, Nathan was quiet in the car. "She's a force," he finally said. "But she's not always right." Sierra didn't speak. Nathan pulled over before her apartment. The rain had picked up, a steady thrum against the windshield. "I love you," he said. She turned to him slowly. "That's not an apology." "It's not meant to be." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a box. Simple. No velvet, no flourish, just him breathing hard. "I was going to wait, but honestly, I don't care what she thinks." He opened the box. The ring wasn't big. It wasn't even new. It was his grandmother's resized for hands that knew work. Sierra looked at it, then at him. "Nathan," she whispered, "you're choosing something that's going to make your life very complicated." He smiled. "Yeah, but finally something real." And in the shadow of a house that had tried to make her feel small, she said yes. 3 days later, Margaret sent a letter. Not a call, not a visit. A letter, inside crisp cursive on monogrammed paper. "Nathan, I will not attend the ceremony. Marrying below your station is your choice, not mine. But I will not be made to pretend this is acceptable. M." Sierra read it once, folded it neatly, then went back to repairing the cracked heel of a stranger's shoe. Quiet, precise, because that's what she did. She fixed the parts no one else saw, even when they broke on purpose. The wedding dress was borrowed. Not in the charming bridal magazine way, no lace veil from a loving aunt, no pearls passed down through generations. It came from a consignment shop on Washington Avenue. Slightly off-white one shoulder strap fraying and a zipper that stuck unless you pulled it just right. Sierra zipped it herself in the back room of the shop. No bridesmaids, no makeup artist. Just her, the cracked mirror, and the memory of her grandfather humming while stitching a broken loafer. She looked at herself. Really looked. No illusion, no fantasy. Just a girl with calloused hands and eyes that had seen enough disappointment to spot it coming a mile away. And yet she was marrying a man who saw her clearly fully and never once tried to make her smaller. The venue was the shoe shop. Of course it was. Blake's Shoe Repair had never hosted a wedding before, but it had held heartbreak celebration, sweat, and hope. It was a cathedral made of leather scraps and the smell of cedar polish. Nathan wore his grandfather's suit 3 inches too short in the sleeve, but he made it work. He showed up early, helped string lights from the rafters, swept the sawdust without being asked. The only flowers were wild picked by neighbors. The music was a playlist Sierra made at 2 a.m. on her cracked phone screen, and when she walked down the makeshift aisle between stacks of shoeboxes and aging workbenches, everyone stood. Not because tradition demanded it, but because something in the air said, "This is real." Margaret wasn't there. She had mailed her silence weeks ago, wrapped in ivory stationery and sealed with disdain. Nathan had never spoken of it again. Sierra didn't need her to. What she needed was here. Her old high school art teacher brought carrot cake. The mailman who always left her packages on the dry step took photos. A pair of teenage twin brothers from the block troublemakers turned part-time apprentices held the ring box like it was gold. Sierra's voice trembled during the vows. Nathan's didn't. He looked at her like he was making a promise to gravity itself. "I want to build things with you," he said. "Not just homes, not just a life, but things that last longer than the people who doubt us." They didn't say "I do," they said yes twice. When the city lights started flickering through the warped shop window and someone turned the music louder, Sierra stepped into the back room to breathe. She needed one moment alone, not out of fear or second thoughts, but to anchor the memory. Because this wasn't just the day she got married. It was the day she stopped apologizing for where she came from. The next morning her grandfather collapsed on the porch. A stroke. Sudden. Unforgiving. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. The grief was different this time. Not sharp, but bone deep. Like she'd been hollowed out in one clean motion. He had raised her with shoe polish under his nails, and a softness rare in men of his generation. He called her kid, even at 29. He believed in the magic of small business and the honesty of a handshake. He taught her that listening wasn't just about ears, it was about noticing what people didn't say. At the reading of the will, there was nothing left to divide. Just the deed to the shop which Nathan helped her secure in her name and a box wrapped in wax paper. Inside a notebook, tattered cover, pages lined by hand, no title, just the initials JRB. Sierra opened it on the bench he used to sit at her wedding bouquet still drying on the windowsill. The first page read, "How people walk tells you how they live." The rest was filled with observations, not of shoes but of people. Notes like, "Woman 50s narrow heel wear on left side equals favors one hip equals probably had surgery. Never asks for help. Pride runs deep. Teen boy laces ripped not frayed equals not wear but force. Maybe bullied. Not random damage. Man new shoes still brings in for polish, ill needs control. Probably in debt." Each entry was a little story, a little clue, a little data point. Sierra didn't cry. She flipped to the last page. Her name was there. Sierra walks like she's already left behind a fire. She closed the book and got to work. It started with Google, then message boards, then free online courses. Keywords, consumer behavior sentiment mapping, UX analytics. She watched YouTube tutorials until her eyes burned, listened to lectures while polishing shoes, took notes during slow days at the shop and coded trial snippets during late nights on the creaky floor laptop balanced on her knees. She didn't know it yet, but this was the first draft of something big. A system that understood people not by what they said they wanted, but by how they moved. Hesitated, repeated, avoided, lingered. She called it resonance. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't market-ready, but it was hers. "I didn't go to college," she whispered once to herself after debugging a script that finally worked. "But I think I just started my own." The invitation came on embossed cardstock with a wax seal bearing the Langford family crest. Sierra found it tucked under the front door one afternoon, nestled between a utility bill and a coupon flyer. The envelope smelled faintly of perfume and rain, as if it had traveled a long, reluctant road to get there. Margaret Langford was inviting her to Christmas dinner, the first since the wedding. No apologies, no warm note, just a line in perfect cursive. "We'll expect you both at 6:00 p.m. Formal attire." Nathan read it twice, his brow furrowed in something between hope and resignation. "Maybe she's trying," he offered. Sierra didn't answer at first. She stared at the words until they stopped meaning anything, until they were just ink on paper as hollow as the house it came from. Still, she agreed to go, not because she believed Margaret wanted reconciliation, but because Nathan believed there might still be a door worth knocking on. and Sierra, for all her scars, hadn't yet learned to stop hoping on someone else's behalf. They arrived early, coats dusted with snow, the city twinkling in the distance like it was pretending to be something softer. Margaret opened the door herself. Always did. As if to remind people that power didn't knock, it received. She wore pearls and a tailored navy dress. Her smile was the kind that never moved past her cheekbones. "Sierra," she said, "you look very seasonal." Sierra smiled. "Thanks, it's called warmth." Margaret didn't respond. Just turned and led them through the echoing hallway to the dining room, where a long table stretched beneath a chandelier that looked like it cost more than Sierra's entire business. The guests were already seated. Friends of the family, former colleagues. One man Sierra recognized from a Forbes profile about hedge funds. Another woman with a voice like ice water who once served as Undersecretary of Trade. Introductions were quick, dismissive. "This is Sierra," Margaret said. "Nathan's wife. She works with shoes." That was all. No mention of the platform Sierra was building. No nod to her growing list of small business clients. Just that she works with shoes. Sierra held her tongue. Dinner was served by staff. The kind of quiet, invisible staff who never made eye contact. Sierra thanked them anyway. The meal passed in low murmurs, political anecdotes, and references to people Sierra had only read about in headlines. Nathan tried to bridge the gaps, pull her into conversations, highlight her insights, but Margaret deflected with surgical precision. Then came the wine, and with it, the moment Sierra would remember for years. Not because it hurt more than anything else, but because it snapped something inside her that had taken too long to break. Someone across the table, a senator's daughter, maybe asked politely, "So what do you do?" Sierra. Before she could answer, Margaret leaned forward, smiling sweetly. "Oh, she fixes shoes," she said, swirling her glass. Nathan could have married anyone, lawyers, diplomats, scholars, but he chose a woman who glues souls. There it was, not shouted, not thrown like a slap, delivered like a compliment, like a joke everyone was supposed to smile at. Silence followed. Not awkward, complicit. The kind that said, "We heard you and were not surprised." Nathan opened his mouth, but Sierra had already stood. She wasn't loud. She didn't cry. She didn't throw the napkin or storm out. She simply said, "Excuse me," and walked away. Through the hall, past the stairs, out the door. The cold hit like truth. She didn't put on her coat. Just kept walking, heels crunching against ice breath, sharp eyes fixed on nothing. She didn't know where she was going. Only that it was away from the table, the chandelier, the performance of belonging she had tried so hard to give meaning to. Hard. Nathan caught up with her 3 blocks down. "Sierra, don't." Her voice was steady, but it cut. "Please don't explain her." He stopped walking. Snow gathered in his hair. "I should have said something," he whispered. She turned to him, hands shaking from cold, not emotion. "It's not about what you say," she said. "It's about what I've been waiting for. From her. From all of them." Nathan looked away, ashamed. "I married you," Sierra said. "Not your mother. But tonight, I realized I've spent the last year auditioning for a seat at a table I don't even want to sit at. I thought if I worked hard enough, smiled enough, succeeded enough, she'd see me." Snow fell between them like tiny acts of forgiveness. "But I'm done," Sierra said. "I'm done waiting to be chosen. From now on, I build the table. I choose who gets to sit at mine." Nathan didn't argue. He just took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. They walked home in silence, hand in hand. That night, Sierra opened her laptop. The code she'd been working on was half finished. A sentiment mapping module, designed to track how customers feel about a brand, not just what they say. She stared at the screen, and for the first time she knew exactly what it was for. Not to prove herself to Margaret Langford, but to build something that didn't require anyone's permission to matter. Not anymore. It started on a sticky note taped to the side of her laptop. People don't tell you what they want. Their feet do. Sierra stared at it every morning like a dare. The quote came from her grandfather's notebook, the one she'd read cover to cover twice since his funeral. The pages were yellowed, curling at the edges, filled with thoughts on gait posture wear patterns and what they revealed about the human condition. But Sierra saw more than cobbler's wisdom. She saw data, not raw numbers, behavioral signals, real-world footprints no algorithm had bothered to measure yet. In that cramped apartment with cracked tile floors and leaky windows, she began stitching together her own theory that digital behavior, when observed like a worn-out heel or a frayed lace, could tell a truer story than any survey or sales report. So she built. The prototype was crude, a patched-together Frankenstein of open-source libraries, Excel sheets and late-night forums filled with AI nerds using usernames like CodeStitcher and Neuron Cowboy. She called it Earstep, a tribute to what her grandfather always said: "Before you fix the soul, you listen to the story underneath it." Earstep wasn't about listening to what customers said. It was about what they didn't say, the way they hovered over a product without clicking, the way they scrolled past 3 options and came back to the second, the time of day they shopped, how many times they returned before buying or never did. She spent 3 months building a minimum viable product with no money, no team, no formal credentials. Just her mind, her will, and a laptop that whined when the CPU got too hot. She pitched it to her first potential client, a boutique candle shop in Center City, run by a couple who called themselves visionary co-alchemists. They smiled politely, said things like "very intriguing" and "let's stay in touch," then never returned her emails. Next came a chain of sneaker stores. The regional manager sat back in his chair, arms crossed, and asked, "So, where did you study?" "I didn't." His smile disappeared. "Then how do we know it works?" Sierra answered honestly, "You test it." He didn't. Investor meetings went the same way. They wanted credentials. She had calluses. They wanted pitch decks. She had field notes. They wanted a Harvard hoodie. She had a South Philly accent. And yet she didn't stop. Every no got filed into a spreadsheet labeled resistance, not for vengeance, for pattern analysis. "I'm not starting from scratch," she told Nathan one night, lying on their futon ankle-deep in printouts and notebooks. "I'm starting from below scratch. I'm starting from minus." He ran his fingers through her hair, quiet, present. "You believe in it?" he asked. Sierra didn't answer right away. She picked up a sticky note, pressed it to his chest. "They don't know what they need until they see it." "I do," he whispered. Nathan never doubted her. Not once. But doubt isn't always loud. Sometimes it creeps in through other voices. Margaret's emails started again, short, precise, like legal memos disguised as motherly concern. "You can't build a future with someone who's chasing fantasies. A man like you deserves an equal, not a project. Every year she plays entrepreneur is a year you delay your career." Nathan never replied, but Sierra saw it in his shoulders. The way he checked his phone and frowned. The way he paused before introducing her at events. The hesitation when someone asked what she did, and he glanced at her, letting her answer instead. One night she overheard him on the phone in the kitchen. "She's not holding me back." Silence. "She's building something. It's just different." Another silence. Then softer. "No, Mom. I'm not asking your permission." When he returned to the bedroom, Sierra pretended to be asleep. But inside her something solidified. Not anger, not shame. Resolve. If the world wouldn't listen, she'd make something so undeniable it couldn't be ignored. She rewrote Earstep's back end. Upgraded the behavioral tracking model. She stopped pitching to people who wanted comfort and started targeting those desperate for insight. People on the verge of collapse who didn't care where the help came from. A local bookstore whose online sales had flatlined. A thrift chain that couldn't explain why customer retention had vanished. A bakery with great reviews but dying foot traffic. Sierra offered to work for free. "Pay me if it works," she said. "Fire me if it doesn't." The first store saw a 23% uptick in conversions after she implemented Earstep's early tracking. The second doubled their email response rate when she adjusted their timing based on user return intervals. The bakery. They sold out 3 weeks in a row after she predicted demand spikes based on weather and calendar behavior. Word spread. slow, uneven, but forward. Still, she was scraping rent. Living off canned soup, debugging code at 2 a.m. in fingerless gloves because their heater wheezed and died every other week. Nathan offered to cover more of the bills. She refused. "I can't build this standing in someone else's shadow," she told him. He kissed her forehead, didn't argue. He didn't always understand her methods, but he never made her feel small for trying. The world did that plenty, but Sierra wasn't trying to be understood. She was trying to build a system that understood people better than they understood themselves. And every rejection, every condescending investor, every dinner party where someone looked past her like she was invisible, all of it went into the machine. Because one day she'd turn it back on them. Not to say, "Look what I did," but to say, "You should have listened." The crisis started on a Tuesday. At 8:47 a.m., the Twitter thread went live 31 consecutive posts from a disgruntled former employee accusing Fair and Grain, a mid-sized organic snack company, of everything from greenwashing to racial discrimination in hiring. By noon it had gone viral. The hashtags multiplied. Influencers picked it up. A few small news outlets ran with it. Their CEO issued a half-hearted statement that sounded like it had been written in a bunker full of lawyers. It only made things worse. That's when they called Sierra, not because they believed in her, not because she was the obvious choice, because they were desperate. Fair and Grain had seen one of her smaller wins, a bakery she'd helped rebrand after an E. coli scare. Word had spread through a Slack group for founders. "She's scrappy, fast, and scary accurate. Doesn't wear suits. Doesn't waste time." Their CMO called her at 3:12 p.m. that same Tuesday. He sounded like someone who hadn't slept. "Can you help us?" he asked. Sierra didn't promise anything, but she said yes, and 5 days later the narrative flipped. She didn't spin, she listened. She scraped the comment sections under old product reviews, mapped customer sentiment over the past 2 years. Found that the issue wasn't rage, it was betrayal. People felt lied to. So she rewrote the response strategy from the inside out. Got Fair and Grain's CEO off the script. Built a timeline of transparent actions. Pushed them to offer real restitution hiring audits, paid leave extensions, supplier reviews. Not band-aids, admissions. They followed her lead, and the public noticed. By Monday, articles with titles like "The Apology That Worked" and "How Fair and Grain Turned It Around" started popping up. One blog even credited a mysterious independent consultant named Sierra Blake. She didn't care about credit. What she cared about was that her system worked. That Earstep, still in its roughest form, had detected emotional rupture and navigated it. The client paid her triple what they'd promised. Nathan brought home a bottle of cheap champagne. They drank it on the floor, barefoot, laptop open between them, showing real-time reputation heat maps, turning from red to yellow to green. Sierra didn't say it out loud that night, but for the first time she let herself believe she might actually win this thing. The fall came a week later. It started with an op-ed in a marketing trade journal, "Ethics in Crisis Management When Scrappy Becomes Sloppy." The article, unsigned, accused her of appropriating pre-existing reputation frameworks without formal accreditation and misleading clients by offering algorithmic tools without transparent vetting. In plain terms, they said she'd stolen her methods. The same week, a former executive from a reputation agency claimed Earstep was identical in logic to a tool they'd pitched to Fair and Grain the year before. The company, facing a second wave of scrutiny, panicked. They froze their contract with Sierra. A statement was released. "We are investigating concerns raised regarding independent consulting services." Just like that, she became radioactive. Potential clients ghosted. A small angel investor who'd been days from wiring funds withdrew, citing concerns over legal clarity. She wasn't sued. Worse, she was discredited. Because you don't need a verdict to kill a reputation. You just need doubt. Doubt is viral. It fills every silence like smoke. Sierra sat at the kitchen table that Thursday night, scrolling through LinkedIn posts, dissecting the Blake scandal. People she'd never met had opinions about her integrity, her intelligence, her methods, her lack of credentials. No one cared that she hadn't stolen anything. No one asked what she'd actually built. They didn't have to. They'd already decided who she was. Nathan paced behind her. "Tell me who wrote that article," he said. "I'll find them." Sierra didn't answer. She clicked on the Fair and Grain website. Their crisis playbook was still up almost word for word the one she'd built. But now it had someone else's name on it. A white label agency with glossy branding. She recognized their CEO. He'd once laughed when she tried to pitch to him. Nathan looked over her shoulder. "They stole your work." Sierra shut the laptop. "No," she said quietly. "They erased it." He dropped into the chair across from her. "You have proof. You can fight this." "I could." Her voice was calm, controlled, the way steel cools after being bent. "But that's not the problem." Nathan stared at her, confused. "The problem," she continued, "is that they don't care if I'm right. They care that I don't look right. No degree, no VC backing, no co-founder in a blazer nodding beside me on stage." She stood, walked to the window, stared out at the city lights flickering in the snow. "I built something that works. But that's not enough. Not here. Not yet." Nathan followed her. He rested his hand on her back. She didn't lean into it. She wasn't broken, not this time. She was learning. Later that night, she opened a new document. At the top, she typed, "What the world actually trusts. Documentation, demonstration, dominance." Then she started writing everything Earstep could do. Every module, every function, every mistake, every test result, every success metric from the last 6 months. She wasn't going to fight with press releases. She was going to build so precisely, so thoroughly, so measurably that no one would ever be able to say she didn't belong again. The world didn't care about where she came from, but it would have to care about what she made next. Because the truth about starting from nothing, you get really good at making something that can't be taken. They say a name can change everything. It doesn't change the work. It doesn't change the weight of what's been lost. But sometimes a new name is how you stop bleeding. Sierra stared at the login screen of her crumbling prototype. The same old interface blinking back like a ghost of the girl who built it. Earstep had taken her as far as it could. But that name born in a basement, whispered through gritted teeth, was now tainted. It lived in forums as a punchline, a rumor, a cautionary tale. She opened a new project file, typed Resonair. A breath, a signal, a resonance. Not just a tracker of behavior anymore, but a reader of silence. A detector of what people didn't say out loud. Resonair would parse tone sentiment, hesitation, contradiction in every comment, click, pause, and abandonment. If Earstep listened to footsteps, Resonair listened to hesitation. She rebuilt it from scratch, scraped everything down to the studs, rewrote the architecture, layered in an emotion detection model inspired by her grandfather's theory. The truth is where the foot lingers, except now it wasn't just feet. It was scrolls, cursor hovers, half-written reviews, voice tones from customer service calls, canceled checkouts at 2:37 a.m. Sierra coded through fever dreams. She drank gas station coffee with the expiry date scratched off. She spoke aloud to herself at 3 a.m. Why did they bounce on the third product page? What hurt them? 1 month in Resonair ran a beta on 10 archived crises from public companies. It correctly predicted emotional backlash patterns in 8. 2 weeks later, she cold emailed Noral Beauty, a national skincare brand that had just survived a PR disaster involving racial insensitivity. Her message didn't have buzzwords, it had proof. "I've rebuilt my tool from the ground up. You're still hemorrhaging trust in demographics your surveys say are recovering. They're not. I can show you why." "I can." 2 hours later, their head of strategy responded, "We'll give you 1 chance. 7 days. Prove it." Sierra didn't sleep for 6. Resonair. Dug into the data trail comments, refund requests, time spent on the About Us page, the microsecond lag when users hovered on the founder's apology video. The insight was clear and brutal. People weren't angry anymore. They were tired. The brand was overcorrecting, flooding feeds with performative messages. It read as desperation. What the audience craved wasn't apology. It was clarity. Sierra scripted a pivot strip, The noise reframe the story. Show internal reform, not ad campaigns. No hashtags. Just transparent proof published hiring reports, policy shifts, redesigned labels, sourced from community consultation. Norel took the gamble. The backlash slowed, then plateaued. 2 influencers who had canceled the brand quietly refollowed them. A newsletter open rate jumped 19% in 1 week. Best of all, return customers who'd ghosted for months began to trickle back. 1 week later, Norel wired payment $42,000, the first 5 digits Sierra had ever seen on one check. She cried in the stairwell, not because of the money, because of the validation. Because Resonair had worked not just in theory, not just in her head, but in the real, brutal, loud world. Nathan found her sitting on the 3rd step, face in her hands. "You did it," he whispered. She shook her head, laughing through her tears. "We did it. You never gave up on me." He held her tighter than he had in months, like he knew what was coming, like he knew everything was about to shift. She didn't buy a car, didn't upgrade apartments, didn't touch the champagne in the fridge. She hired 3 people. None of them had Ivy League degrees. One was a part-time librarian who moonlighted as a data cleaner. One was a laid-off marketing analyst with ADHD and a vendetta against fake empathy. The last was a 21-year-old hacker from Detroit who spoke in memes but could write code that sang. They rented a loft above an abandoned art gallery on South Street. No heating, no elevator, 1 bathroom. But it had light. Huge windows. Concrete floors. A skylight that leaked but made the afternoons glow like resurrection. The first day Sierra walked in with a whiteboard and no plan. She stood in front of them and said, "I don't want to build a tech company. I want to build a listening machine. I want to build something that hears what the world is too afraid to say." They stared, then nodded, and Resonair began. They worked 14-hour days. They ate dollar pizza. They mapped emotional trajectories across demographics. They built models that didn't just crunch numbers. They asked questions. Like, what does silence mean in a community used to being ignored? Like, when does outrage turn into apathy, and how do you catch it before it does? Clients began to trickle in. Not household names, but scrappy companies trying to survive bad headlines and worse trust. One of them said, "Your tool doesn't sound like AI, it sounds like conscience." Sierra wrote that down, pinned it on the wall. But still, she didn't tell Margaret. Not yet. Because it wasn't time. Because this wasn't revenge. This was return. She hadn't come back to prove anything to anyone. She'd come to rewrite the rules on her own terms. And every keystroke, every late-night brainstorm, every check with a comma in it, was another brick in the road she was paving toward that one room, that one table, that one moment. The moment where the woman who called her a mistake would finally have to sit down and listen. The phone rang just after midnight. Nathan didn't recognize the number at first. The screen just glowed against the darkness of their bedroom, cutting across the ceiling like a scalpel. He slipped out quietly into the hallway, pressing it to his ear. "Hello?" A pause. Then her voice, polished confidence, soaked in silk and arsenic. "Nathan, it's Mother." He closed the door behind him as if Sierra could hear the chill coming down the line. "You shouldn't be calling this late," he said, jaw tight. Margaret ignored him. "I've been looking at Sierra's business," she said. "This platform of hers. Resonair." Nathan's spine straightened. "She built that from nothing." "Yes, and sometimes nothing is what it returns to," Margaret said calmly. "I've seen the reports. Money's moving strangely, funding from shadow firms, growth that doesn't quite add up. I'm concerned." Nathan exhaled slowly. "She's clean. Every dollar is accounted for. I'm not asking for your defense, I'm asking for your help." Silence. "You're a lawyer," she continued. "A damn good one. You know what it means when someone scales too fast without oversight. You married her. You should protect her even from herself." "I'm not spying on my wife." "No," she said sharply. "You're making sure your future isn't built on sand." She hung up before he could answer. 3 days later, a man named Jonah Murch walked into Resonair, late 30s, clean cut, glasses without fingerprints. Said he'd worked in startup compliance and tech ethics. Said he loved what Sierra was building. Said he wanted to help her scale responsibly. His resume checked out. The hacker on the team did a light scan and shrugged. Looks fine. Sierra interviewed him personally. He spoke in metrics and philosophy. Transparency isn't just about what you show, it's about what you prove you didn't hide. She liked that. They hired him as a temporary operations consultant. Within 48 hours, he had access to system logs. It began with something small, a lag in the back-end logs, a diagnostic tool hanging longer than usual. Sierra was debugging a feedback loop when she noticed it, code strings duplicating over and over again, like a whisper repeating in a room that no one had entered. She called the hacker Juno. "This isn't us," Sierra said, pointing at the terminal. "That's not a feature I built," Juno frowned. "It's a listener script, hidden in the analytics core. It's pulling query strings and caching them to an external address. Someone's watching how our clients use the platform." Juno's fingers flew over the keys. "No worse. They're pulling what our tool uncovers. Emotional metrics, user sentiment curves, predictive distrust scores. The entire playbook." A beat of silence passed. Sierra whispered, "We've been breached." Panic is a luxury she no longer allowed herself. Instead, she made a list. 1. Lock external ports. 2. Disconnect cloud backups. 3. Ping every client schedule and emergency audit under the guise of routine optimization. 4. And Jonah. Find out what he's touched. She called a meeting. The team sat on mismatched chairs, legs bouncing, eyes darting. "I need everyone to understand," Sierra said, voice low. "This is not a drill. Someone got in. Someone we let in. And they're not after money. They're after credibility," Juno added. "If they leak what they're stealing, they can fabricate proof that we manipulate sentiment on behalf of clients. Imagine what that headline looks like." Sierra knew. She didn't need to imagine. It would destroy everything. She found Jonah on the fire escape drinking coffee like nothing was wrong. "Where did you work before this?" she asked without preamble. He turned slowly, still wearing that perfectly neutral expression. "DC, a few agencies, some private firms." "Who sent you?" He smiled faintly. "Why does someone always have to send someone?" "Because normal consultants don't run silent scripts in my architecture. And they don't reroute emotional trust scores to an IP in Alexandria, Virginia." Jonah's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "You're good. I'll give you that." She took a step forward. "Tell her," Sierra said. "Tell Margaret Langford that I'm not the girl she humiliated at Christmas. I'm not the shoe fixer she erased from the family tree. She thinks you're laundering money through shell firms in Estonia. I'm laundering doubt into belief. And I have no patience for people who mistake power for purity." Jonah shrugged. "Then you should have built something less valuable." He moved past her calmly, walked down the stairs, disappeared. She didn't call the cops. Not yet, because she needed to clean house first. 2 nights later, the breach deepened. Someone tried to override their local encryption. Sierra's laptop locked mid-compile. Screens across the office flickered with corrupted dashboards. Juno screamed from the other side of the room. "They're trying to wipe us out." Sierra grabbed her backup drive, the one she kept in the wall vent behind the coffee machine, and plugged it in. "Go dark," she ordered. "But now." They shut down everything. No Wi-Fi, no servers. They copied only the most essential logs, and Sierra called every active client personally. "Yes, there was an issue. No data was leaked. We're migrating architecture. You'll be updated." She lied cleanly, like a woman who had lied before to survive something worse. At 3:07 a.m., she sat alone in the office, staring at the dim glow of a backup server, the only heartbeat left in the room. Nathan walked in carrying 2 cups of tea. He set one down. "She called me," he said. "My mother." "I know," Sierra whispered. "I didn't help her, I swear." Sierra nodded, then looked him in the eye. "But you almost did." The silence between them was sharp. "I didn't want to believe she'd go that far," he said. "She spent her whole life believing that power should go that far." He looked down. "What do you want me to do?" Sierra exhaled slowly. "Stand behind me." Then quieter. "No matter who stands in front." Nathan nodded. And for the first time in a long while, Sierra believed him. She opened her laptop and wrote the line of code that would become Resonair's greatest firewall. Not against bots, not against leaks, against people who underestimated how loud a woman's silence could be before she decided to speak. There's a strange kind of stillness that comes after a digital war. The office was quiet. Too quiet for a company that had just survived a full-scale breach. But Sierra moved through the space like a conductor orchestrating silence into a plan. Her team was exhausted, running on caffeine and adrenaline. But their eyes now held something they hadn't had before: trust. That morning, she sat down with someone new. His name was Ellis North, former cyber warfare analyst turned private security consultant. Long beard, tired eyes, hands that tapped faster than they spoke. "You don't want me to fix your breach," he said, glancing at the printed log files Sierra had dumped across the desk. "You want me to find the who." Sierra leaned forward. "No, I want to find the why." It took Ellis 36 hours. First, he mapped the data trail obscured by 7 layers of VPN masks and 1 fake Canadian shell company. Then he isolated the rogue scripts Jonah Murch had embedded. Each one had a signature, a thumbprint of whoever wrote the code. Jonah didn't write it. "Whoever programmed this was smarter," Ellis muttered. "More paranoid, too. Embedded recursive time triggers mimicry routines. This wasn't freelance sabotage. This was state-level espionage techniques." So Sierra asked. He turned his laptop toward her. 1 IP blinked on the screen. 192.85.14.1, Washington, D.C. Registered under an internal server belonging to the Langford Institute of Political Strategy. Sierra didn't blink. "That's Margaret's private office." Ellis looked at her. "You want to go public?" She shook her head. "I want to go louder." Sierra drafted a document herself. 42 pages. Detailed. Forensic. Every hack, every hidden access point, every dollar traced. But she didn't send it to the police. She sent it to the Inkwell, a digital-first investigative journalism group with a reputation for tearing through political armor. She didn't use her name. The files arrived anonymously with one subject line: "When power attacks potential." The story hit the internet 2 days later. "Breaking top politician's office linked to cyber attack on minority-owned tech startup." The article named no names, but the metadata spoke for itself. Leaked documents, server pings, email headers. Sierra had buried a breadcrumb trail deep enough for any real journalist to follow. Within 12 hours, 3 different news stations had picked it up. Within 24, Sierra's name was everywhere. They called her a whistleblower, a fighter, a survivor. But to Margaret, she was a liability. Nathan heard about it while standing in line for coffee. His phone buzzed. "Margaret, we need to talk, privately." He met her at a private club in downtown D.C. Margaret didn't order anything, just sat across from her son, face unreadable. "You leaked it." Nathan shook his head. "I didn't even know until I saw the article." "She's ruining me. She's exposing you." Margaret's voice lowered. "I have worked my entire life to maintain one thing: control. Control of the narrative. Control of our legacy. And she thinks she can dismantle that with code and pity." Nathan said nothing. "She's not like us, Nathan. She doesn't know what it takes to last in this world." He finally looked at her. "No, Mom. You're right. She knows how to build something better." Back at Resonair, Sierra watched the chaos unfold on the screen. News anchors shouting over each other. Political analysts speculating whether Margaret Langford would be subpoenaed. She wasn't celebrating. She was preparing. Juno walked in with a file. "You sure you don't want to press charges?" Sierra took the folder. It was full of legal drafts, possible suits, civil damages, federal violations. "I'm not interested in revenge," she said quietly. "I'm interested in consequence." On the 3rd day, Sierra received a letter. From the Congressional Ethics Committee, Margaret Langford had been formally summoned to testify regarding misuse of political infrastructure for private sabotage. The letter was short, but the meaning echoed. For the first time in her public career, Margaret was being questioned by the very system she once controlled. But Sierra wasn't done. She sat in her old apartment that night, the one above her grandfather's now shuttered shoe shop. The wooden walls still smelled like leather and coffee. She pulled out his old notebook, the one that taught her how to read a customer by the way they shifted their weight, the way their heels wore down, the invisible language of need. She thought about every person who ever underestimated her, every door that closed before she even knocked, every room where she wasn't invited but built her own floor beneath it. And she whispered not to the world but to the girl she once was. They came for my silence, but I made them choke on my data. 3 weeks later, Resonair gained 2 new Fortune 100 clients. Investors who had once ghosted her came crawling back. But Sierra didn't forget. She didn't forgive. Because in the end, what she gave the world was more than code, more than a story of survival. She gave them a blueprint for how to turn damage into definition, and how to turn truth into a weapon that no dynasty could dodge. The stage was a halo of white light and brushed steel. The backdrop behind the podium pulsed with a slow transition of soft blues and golds, the global brand of the World Crisis Management Forum. It was the kind of conference where every word spoken could shift stock prices, where reputations weren't just made, they were weaponized. Sierra stood behind the velvet curtain, her fingers curled around a thumb drive. The room beyond was quiet, the kind of hush that came not from respect, but from pure, coiled expectation. She wasn't nervous. She was calibrated. Behind her, Nathan adjusted her mic. His hands were steady, his breath warm on her neck. "You've already won," he whispered. She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the thin sliver between the curtain edges, the gap through which she saw the audience, and saw her, Margaret Langford. First row, dead center, charcoal gray suit, pearls, arms crossed, face unreadable. But her eyes, they were the only thing that moved. Sharp, tracking, calculating. Sierra didn't flinch. Let her watch. 2 months earlier, this invitation had been laughable. The forum had never invited a company under 10 years old to speak, let alone one led by someone without an Ivy League degree, a board of governors, or a political godfather. But the breach changed that. The story of Resonair surviving an internal sabotage attempt and coming back stronger wasn't just impressive, it was disruptive. It challenged the old models, it scared people, and what scares people sells. They extended the invitation with urgency cloaked in formality. "We believe your insights would bring unique value to the global conversation." What they meant was, your voice is too loud to ignore now. Backstage, the moderator leaned toward her. "Ready for your cue?" Sierra nodded once. 3 minutes. You're the closing keynote. Everyone's staying for you. The man smiled, but his eyes were doubtful. She knew that look. Still trying to understand how someone like her, no pedigree, no boardroom polish, had arrived here. Nathan caught the man's glance and stepped forward. "Let me remind you," he said calmly, "she doesn't arrive anywhere. She builds it from the ground up." The moderator flushed slightly and looked away. Sierra touched Nathan's arm gently. "Let him stare," she murmured. "He's just late to the story." Her turn. As she stepped out, the lights softened, spotlighting her presence like the lens of the world had narrowed to a single focal point. The silence in the room shifted recognition, curiosity, even caution. People knew her now, but they hadn't heard her. Not like this. The podium was made of sleek acrylic. Her reflection trembled slightly in it, but not from fear, from momentum. Behind her, a giant screen displayed one word in clean Helvetica font: Resonair. She slid the thumb drive into the slot, paused, and began. "My name is Sierra Blake, clear, low, controlled. I was born in Philadelphia. My first customer wasn't a shareholder or a CEO. He was a plumber named George with a cracked heel and a limp he didn't like to talk about." Soft laughter in the room. Margaret didn't blink. "I grew up in a shoe repair shop run by my grandfather. We didn't have customer analytics, but we had listening. We didn't have market insights, but we had pain. Every foot that walked through that door told us a story if you knew where to look." A few heads nodded, phones stilled. She had them. But when I entered the tech world, no one wanted stories. They wanted credentials, titles, proof I belonged. She looked directly at Margaret for half a second. I had none of those. But I had data. Not the kind that lives in spreadsheets, but the kind that lives between the lines of human frustration. Abandoned carts, complaint tickets, post-scandal silence. She leaned forward. Pain has a pattern, and patterns can be read. Nathan watched from the wing. His hands were clenched. He'd seen Sierra speak to teams, to investors, to survivors, but never to a room that once would have shut its doors on her. She didn't just fill the room, she reshaped it. I built Raisonnaire. Not because I wanted to disrupt the system, she continued. I built it because I was tired of watching good ideas get buried under shame and spin. I've watched brands implode because they chose silence over sincerity. She clicked the remote. Behind her, a chart appeared. Emotion analytics. Red spikes, blue troughs. This is the heart rate of a scandal, she said. But it's also the heartbeat of trust when you know how to read it. Gasps rippled across the audience. She turned to face the crowd fully. I was accused of not belonging, of not being polished enough, pedigreed enough, passive enough. She let that hang. But I don't polish. I recode. I don't inherit rooms. I enter them, eyes wide, some leaning forward, a few blinking back emotion. Even Margaret had shifted, just slightly, enough for Sierra to see the jaw tighten. She smiled. This stage was never built for people like me. But that's the beauty of crisis. It tears down walls. It reveals character. And if you survive it, it gives you the right. She paused. To rebuild. Applause began soft, respectful, but it didn't stay soft. It swelled. A standing ovation led by a woman in a navy blazer 2 rows behind Margaret. More stood. More clapped. It wasn't polite, it was earned. Margaret sat still, but her eyes weren't cold anymore. They were quiet, and somewhere behind the practiced hardness conflicted. Sierra held her gaze, not in defiance, in clarity. As the applause thundered, Sierra stepped back from the podium. Nathan appeared beside her, pride etched in every feature. You didn't just speak, he whispered, wrapping an arm around her waist. You shifted something. She nodded slowly, then whispered back. Now comes the echo. Sierra walked back toward the center of the stage, alone now. The applause from her earlier address had faded, but the energy hadn't left the room. It hung thick in the air, expectation, reverence, and something else, silence that listened. Behind her, the massive screen dimmed and the spotlight narrowed. This wasn't about slides anymore. This was about voice. She stepped to the microphone, placed both hands gently on the sides of the podium, and for a moment, just stood there. No preamble. No notes. Then she spoke. When I was 12, Sierra said quietly, I saw a woman throw away a pair of shoes because she said they were too dirty to fix. My grandfather took them out of the trash. He cleaned the blood off the soles. He restitched the lining. And then he made me wear them to learn. Not because we couldn't afford better, but because he said every footprint tells a story, even when people try to erase it. The audience leaned in. I never forgot that. She paused, scanning the room. Her gaze floated over diplomats, CEOs, technocrats, until it almost met Margaret Langford's. But she didn't lock eyes. She didn't need to. I was raised by a man who taught me that dignity isn't something you inherit. It's something you give. Every day. To people who are invisible to the world. Her voice didn't shake. If anything, it carved. And yet somewhere along the way, I forgot that. The crowd held its breath. I tried to belong in rooms that were never built for people like me. I wore suits that didn't fit. Memorized acronyms I didn't believe in. Smiled through dinners where people said things like, she fixes shoes, how charming. She let the words hang in the air like smoke. They didn't know I could hear them. I've been called unqualified, unpolished, uninvited. I've been asked at conferences like this. Where did you go to school? Who mentored you? What does your husband think of your work? She raised one brow just slightly. No one ever asked me what I see when I look at silence. The screen behind her lit up just for a second with a pulse graph, then faded again. In silence, I've seen the raw truth of customer betrayal. The moment a brand loses its soul. The milliseconds between scandal and spin. She tapped the podium softly. But more than that, I've seen the quiet heartbreak of workers blamed for systems they didn't build. I've watched young women get fired for asking the right questions too early in the wrong room. A low hum of emotion passed through the crowd. I know what it means to be on the outside looking in, but I also know what happens when the outsider decides to stay outside and build something stronger. Sierra stepped away from the podium. Just a few feet. She let her hands fall to her sides. No defense. No barrier. I was once kicked out of a holiday party. She said it lightly, like a fact in a resume no one wanted to read. I wore a blue dress that night. My husband, who was then my fiancé, had convinced me to come. Said it would be different this time. People shifted in their seats. 30 minutes in, a woman leaned across the table and said, "Your hands are too rough for champagne glasses." And just like that, my invitation vanished. No names. No pointing. But every word was a blade wrapped in grace. I walked home that night. Through the snow. I remember thinking I am never going to be enough for them. A pause. But then I realized I wasn't meant to be. Her voice lifted slightly now. A turn. A shift. I wasn't meant to be a placeholder in someone else's narrative. I wasn't meant to chase chairs at someone else's table. She looked up not at anyone in particular, but towards something larger. I was meant to build the table, and then came the silence. Not empty silence. Sacred silence. The kind that follows truth when it's too deep to clap for yet. Sierra stepped back to the podium. I don't share this because I want pity or revenge. I'm not interested in naming names or reliving shame. I share it because the people who are often treated as the least deserving of success are usually the most equipped to transform it. A beat. Let me say that again. The lights dimmed further. Her voice rang out clearer. The people who are told they don't belong, they are the ones who know how to rebuild what's broken. Because they've lived in the cracks. She nodded to the technician. The final slide flashed. Resilience is not a trait, it's a decision. No logo. No branding. Just that sentence. White text, black background. The crowd rose. It didn't happen all at once. It began with a man in the second row, then a woman with tears in her eyes, then a cluster of international delegates, and then the whole room was standing. Nathan closed his eyes for a moment. Let it settle in his chest. And in the front row, Margaret Langford stood too. But not immediately. She didn't clap. She didn't smile. But she stood, and she bowed her head. Just a few degrees, just once. Sierra saw it. A flicker, not of triumph, but of closure. Not acceptance. Not defeat, but a quiet, undeniable recognition. A nod. From the empire to the outsider who refused to burn. Sierra took one final breath at the podium. Then without fanfare she stepped down, and as she passed the curtain, the world of glass towers, elite families, and impossible rooms shifted behind her. She didn't need to be invited back. She wasn't leaving. She had rebuilt the room. The hall had emptied. The cameras had shut off. The applause had faded to memory. But Sierra's name remained etched in every headline on every investor's lips, embedded in every contract waiting to be signed. By the end of that week, Resonair was no longer just a startup with an edge. It was the global standard for emotional intelligence crisis response. They crossed $12 billion in valuation before the quarter ended. And Sierra Blake, she didn't celebrate in champagne rooms or marble offices. She went home, not to the penthouse overlooking the Delaware River, but to a small co-working space she still kept open in South Philly. She walked in quietly, nodded to the young coder at the front desk, barely 21 ex-barista, and placed a handwritten note on the bulletin board. Remember, the first version of Resonair was built on a laptop with a cracked screen and a mind nobody believed in. Keep building. Below it she pinned a check blank except for the signature. It was time for others to start. The press called her the fixer who rewired the world. Sierra hated that label. She didn't fix the world. She listened to it. And then she taught it to listen to itself. In the months that followed the global summit, Sierra launched the Blake Foundation, a venture and mentorship grant specifically for women with no formal degrees but a track record of grit. Not just for tech. For anything that required fire and faith. No interviews, no standardized applications. Just stories. Applicants sent videos, audio, letters. One woman mailed in a broken USB drive with her pitch inside saying, "If she was once a shoemaker, she'll understand why I only have this." Sierra watched them all. She stayed up until 3 a.m. most nights reading stories between code reviews and partnership calls. Not because she had to, but because she knew buried in those voices was another her, and another, and another. It wasn't about giving back. It was about building forward. One evening, Nathan came home to find her on the kitchen floor barefoot, surrounded by old notebooks, pitch decks, and photos of the workshop she used to share with her grandfather. There was a faded picture taped to her laptop, her hands black with polish grinning beside a torn pair of boots. Nathan sat beside her. "You always come back to this," he said gently. Sierra looked at the picture for a long time. "This," she said, touching the image, "is where I learned how to feel data." He didn't interrupt. He just waited. After a while, he asked, "Do you ever regret it?" Sierra looked up. "What?" Staying silent for so long. "Letting her talk down to you. All those years." She smiled, not bitterly, not even sadly, but with the steady, anchored calm of someone who had walked the fire and emerged scarless by choice. "No," she said. "I let time speak, and time is louder than ego." Nathan leaned his back against the fridge and watched her for a moment. He remembered the woman who once walked out of his mother's holiday party in the snow, refusing a coat out of pride. He remembered how her fingers bled when they moved into their first apartment, because she insisted on fixing the plumbing herself. He remembered the late nights when her eyes burned from screen glare, and still she whispered to him, "Just one more hour." And now the world watched her speak in hours. A week later, at a private gathering of angel investors and policy reformers, Sierra refused the seat at the center of the table. Instead, she stood beside a teenage girl from Detroit who had just been funded by the Blake Foundation to build wearable devices for nonverbal autistic children. Sierra let the girl speak first, let her own the stage. The girl stammered, sweated, dropped her paper. Sierra leaned in, whispered something no mic caught, and the girl smiled and kept going. Later, someone asked Sierra, "Why didn't you headline?" She just said, "I already had my microphone moment." Now it's her turn. Resonaire's board wanted to expand into military applications. Sierra said no. Emotion should never be weaponized. They offered to buy her out. She turned them down. A week later, they all voted unanimously in her favor. She wasn't just a CEO anymore. She was the moral compass of the company, and everyone knew if you pushed her against her values, you lost. One quiet morning, Sierra returned to the same bench outside the building where she and Nathan had once lived, when Resonaire was nothing but an idea on coffee-stained napkins. The bench was older now, so was she, but the sky was the same. She pulled out the worn, leather-bound notebook her grandfather had left her, the one with the scribbled notes about foot pressure, gait psychology, and how people walk differently when they lie. She added a new page. People also breathe differently when they're believed in. She closed it gently, and for the first time in years, tears filled her eyes, not because of grief, but because of peace. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy, and unmarked except for a single name in slanted cursive, Sierra. Nathan found it first wedged gently in the slats of their old mailbox. There was no return address, no indication of who had delivered it, but Sierra knew the handwriting. Elegant, controlled, practiced. Margaret. She opened it that evening at the kitchen table, her fingers pausing at the wax seal blood red like something from another century. Inside 4 lines, neatly penned. "I would like to speak with you. Not as a politician, not as a mother, but as a woman who once got it terribly wrong. If you're willing, Saturday. 10 a.m., Café Eloin. No cameras, no press, just us. No signature, but she didn't need one. Saturday arrived colder than expected. The sky was pearl gray, the wind restless. Café Eloin sat tucked between a florist and a record store, its windows fogged its door, jingling softly every time someone stepped in. Sierra arrived early. not out of eagerness, but precision. She chose the table in the far back corner beneath a faded photo of a cobbler's hands. She ordered tea. Jasmine. No sugar. At exactly 10:00 a.m., the bell above the door rang and Margaret Blake entered. Same steel hair. Same perfectly tailored coat. But there was a slight hesitation in her step, as if gravity had grown heavier in her bones. She scanned the room, then spotted Sierra and paused. Their eyes met. For once, Sierra didn't look away. Margaret approached slowly, carrying no purse, no folder, no barrier. Sierra gestured toward the seat opposite her, silent. Margaret sat smoothing her gloves with deliberate slowness. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said softly. Sierra raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't sure you'd ask." Silence. The waitress appeared briefly. Margaret ordered black coffee. Nothing else. When she left, Margaret reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. She laid it on the table. A headline screamed in bold, "From Cobbler's Granddaughter to CEO. How Resonair Rebuilt Global Trust." Below it, a photo Sierra on the summit stage, mid-speech, hand open like a bridge. The same photo now framed in the hallway of the White House's Innovation Wing. Margaret touched the corner of the clipping. "I read this 5 times, she said. "It took me until the 4th to realize the only name you didn't mention was mine." Sierra didn't smile. "Why would I?" Margaret sighed, deep, deliberate. Her voice dipped lower. "Because I earned it. The right to be acknowledged, even if only as your enemy." Sierra folded her hands on the table. Her nails were short, unpainted. "Margaret," she said evenly, "you don't get to define the narrative anymore. That ended when you planted malware in my servers." A slight flinch, but Margaret recovered quickly. "I didn't give that order." "But you empowered someone who did," Sierra replied. "And you called me a liability. In public. Twice." Margaret's jaw clenched. She reached for the coffee sipped, then set it down with a tremor in her wrist. "Do you think I don't regret that?" she asked. Sierra leaned back slightly, eyes unblinking. "I think you regret being wrong, not being cruel." Another silence. Outside the window, a group of children passed by, laughing, chasing each other with paper planes. Inside the cafe hummed with warmth and quiet conversation. A world going on, unaware of the generational wound at that corner table. Margaret reached into her coat again, pulled out something smaller this time. A shoehorn, worn smooth from use, the initials CB engraved at the top. "I found this in a box Nathan packed years ago," she said. "It was your grandfather's, wasn't it?" Sierra nodded, surprised. "I didn't understand what you two had," Margaret continued. "That shop. That discipline. I thought you were fixing shoes." "I didn't realize you were reading people." Sierra stared at the shoehorn. Her throat tightened, but she didn't pick it up. "I thought you were just sealing souls," Margaret whispered. "But you were gluing broken identities back together." A pause, and then, "I was wrong." The words hovered unpolished, imperfect, but real. Still Sierra didn't soften. "Margaret," she said slowly, "you don't owe me an apology." Margaret blinked. "No," Sierra repeated. "Because I didn't need your blessing to begin, and I don't need your guilt to continue." Margaret swallowed. Her face aged 10 years in 10 seconds. "I thought you came for a confession," Sierra added. "No," Margaret said quietly. "I came to see how small I'd become." The words were not dramatic, not performative. They dropped like stones into still water, rippling across years of icy distance. Sierra reached forward not to touch her, but to slide the shoehorn gently back across the table. She looked Margaret in the eyes, calm and unshaking. "I'm not angry anymore," she said. "But I'm also not here to validate you." Margaret gave a single nod. Not defensive, not defeated, just finished. "I understand." She stood slowly, took her coat, her pride, and the coffee she barely touched. As she turned to leave, she paused beside Sierra's chair. "You were right to ignore me," she said. "The world listened because you didn't waste time trying to convince me." Then she walked away. Sierra sat for a long while after she left. She stared at the empty cup, the folded clipping, the shoehorn, and then she picked it up, ran her fingers along the initials, felt the indentation of her grandfather's thumb still etched into the grain. She whispered almost to herself, "You raised me to fix what people throw away." Then she smiled, not because anything was healed, but because nothing had the power to break her anymore. The email arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Subject: proposal for collaborative counsel. Sierra opened it out of routine, thinking it was another pitch deck, another brand asking for a meeting. But the signature stopped her cold. Margaret Whitmore, former senator, mother-in-law, former adversary. The body of the message was short, direct, and most shockingly humble. "I've seen what your foundation is doing. I believe traditional institutions need to be part of that change. If you're willing to have a conversation, I'd like to offer my experience on behalf of the women you're helping." Sierra didn't respond immediately. She stared at the screen long enough for the tea beside her to cool. Then she leaned back in her chair, eyes scanning the room of Resonaire's new global headquarters, a floor-to-ceiling glass structure in downtown San Francisco. Behind her on the shelf sat the first pair of shoes she ever mended, her name embossed on the sole. That was the only legacy she truly believed in: transformation through the dirt, not despite it. Nathan knocked gently on the open door. He had the kind of look that only husbands who've witnessed every battle up close could wear, curious, cautious, slightly amused. "She emailed you." Sierra turned the laptop toward him. He chuckled, slow and surprised. "You just made my mother ask you for a job. You do realize this?" "I didn't make her," Sierra replied, sipping her tea, now lukewarm. "I just built something she didn't think I could." That weekend they met. The coffee shop wasn't grand. Sierra chose it intentionally, a modest cafe tucked in the Mission District walls, lined with mismatched chairs and local art. It smelled like roasted beans and old wood, the kind of place no senator would have chosen on her own. That was the point. Margaret arrived exactly on time, not a second early, not a second late. She wore her trademark navy suit brooch of the Whitmore family crest pinned just below her collar. But her face, always taut, always unreadable, was softer, older, not in age but in weight. She sat across from Sierra with a measured calm. "I didn't expect you to say yes," Margaret began. "I didn't say yes yet," Sierra said gently. Margaret's lips twitched. "Fair." There was a moment of silence filled only by the espresso machine hissing behind them. "I'll be honest," Margaret continued. "I once believed success had to follow a certain path. Legacy schools, prestigious internships, the whole pedigree. You didn't fit. And instead of questioning the system, I questioned you." Sierra let the words sit between them. She watched Margaret carefully, not with bitterness, but curiosity, like a woman assessing the weather before planting something new. "I understand why you did it," Sierra finally said. "You thought protecting your son meant guarding your world." Margaret inhaled deeply, then nodded. "I did. And now I see how small that world was." Sierra folded her hands on the table. "Why now?" "Because the world is listening to people like you, Sierra. And it should. But I also believe change that lasts must include bridges. I have 3 decades of navigating systems broken as they are. Let me help you tear them down, from the inside." For a moment, Sierra said nothing. She glanced out the window where the fog was starting to lift. Across the street, a girl was taping a handwritten flyer to a pole code club for girls. No experience needed. And Sierra remembered herself 17 with calloused hands and a borrowed laptop watching online courses at 2 a.m. while repairing boots. She turned back to Margaret. "If I say yes," Sierra said, "it's not for you." Margaret nodded. "Of course. It's for the girl out there who doesn't know the words venture capital, but knows what it's like to be counted out." "I understand. And you won't be there to advise them on how to play by the old rules," Sierra added. "You'll help explain why those rules need rewriting." Margaret smiled truly this time. "Then I hope I'm ready to listen." Sierra extended her hand across the table. "I don't need your apology," she said. "You've earned something harder than that. You've earned a seat." The bell above the door gave the same soft chime it always had. The old shoe shop on 3rd and Layton still smelled like polish and dust, but now the shelves were lined with more than just leather soles. There were books, tablets, whiteboards, and a glowing digital sign. Mentor Lab Fix What's Broken. Build What's Yours. Sierra stood behind the counter, her hands no longer calloused from glue and stitching, but her stance still firm. She wore the same boots she once rebuilt a dozen times, now polished and whole. A girl no more than 10 pushed the door open, clutching a pair of scuffed sneakers against her chest. Her coat was too thin for the weather.